everyone. Thanks again for participating in the USC Aikens National Distance Learning Week virtual conference. Some of you I've seen earlier this week, so I appreciate you following us and attending this particular event. Just a couple of house notes before Helen gets started. Should you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the chat area, and I will help facilitate those for Helen. If you want to download a version of her presentation, click on the file that's located in the bottom right corner of your screen. Click the Download Files button and follow any on-screen instructions to get that file to your computer. Towards the end of this session, I'm going to push out a link to your browser, which should open in a new window. And if you would, please take about 15 to 30 seconds to fill out that two-question survey for Helen. I'm sure she'll appreciate that. So we have Helen Schleckser. Helen, I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's Schleckser, and it's hard for me too, even though I've had it for a real long time.
Oh, sorry, Helen.
That's okay.
But Helen is an instructor in the School of Advanced Studies from the University of Phoenix. And her presentation today is a case study of 21st century skills perceptions utilizing game-based instructional media. So whenever you're ready, Helen, take it away.
I am. First, a very special thanks to Dr. Veronica Outlaw. She's been awesome all week as a mediator and a host for this conference. It's been a very fulfilling week for most of us in distance learning, and we really do appreciate it. So thank you. Second of all, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Helen Schleckser. I teach in higher education, and I also manage large projects for various organizations outside of academia. The reason that I describe myself in this way is because each of us here seems to have many roles, many responsibilities, and I feel that it translates well into some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So I believe, as many do, that everyone in this world is both student and teacher. And in this spirit, I would like to ask everyone's participation as a student, as a teacher, because today's presentation is all about questions, ways in which to look at a situation and ways in which to learn more. Some of the things in this presentation, some of the background, is proposed research, but it is not research in progress. So please join me in a feed-forward approach, one that says, would you consider? Please ask questions. Please bring up any comments that you may have in this approach to digging deeper into some of our real-world problems. And again, this graphic is a little bit busy. It's about questions. It's about focusing on questions, but it does not have answers, analysis, or outcomes. That happens later with research. So thank you. I'm sharing this information here today because I believe it has relevance to each of us in our varied roles. We're distance learning professionals. We're also parents with children who may be entering the workforce. We're individuals who work outside of academia, who may work in organizations where we're hiring, we're interviewing, we're looking at prospective people entering into the workforce. So from a distance learning perception today, we're going to talk a little bit about 21st century skills, educational technology, game-based learning, and some of the connections or perceived connections between education and workforce preparedness. So students of root cause analysis may recognize the importance of understanding how asking questions and considering multiple inputs into the problem is a better approach than just applying a patch to the so-called symptoms. So in a seeking to understand perception, there's the realization that problems are often not simple, not linear, and not one-dimensional. So in a way, the graphic is misleading, but it's deliberately misleading because there's not one answer to any real one problem. So my question that I'm digging deeper into is a question that I'm asking everyone to think about. We have faculty people on this call, and I'm saying, what constitutes faculty perception of preparedness for real work in the 21st century? The reason I'm asking this is there's a discrepancy. It seems like a really, really easy question. What do you think about it? Everyone might think the same thing, but there is a disparity in how people, depending on who the stakeholders are, what their interests are, perceive the situation. One research area is cited there, but the research is consistent in that education providers believe graduates are well prepared for the workforce. If I would challenge anyone here to look at any website for any college and find something that says that they do not prepare people for the workforce. There is an increased focus on education to workforce preparedness, and education providers across the board believe that their graduates are well prepared for the workforce. Where the discrepancy comes in is employers state that entry-level vacancies are the result of inadequate competency in necessary skills. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what necessary skills means. Learners also believe that they don't meet basic competency requirements for entry-level jobs, which is kind of interesting considering people are looking for jobs, people aren't finding jobs, and yet there's a perceived skills shortage. It doesn't seem like it should be a difficult question. Work in the 21st century requires critical thinking, collaboration, teamwork, and a systems thinking approach to problem solving. Because of that, there seems to be finger pointing. The graphic is specifically targeted towards a comment, just an out of the blue comment that says, wow, maybe schools are challenged to design learning experiences that are optimized for workplace needs. This particular source is from 2012, but again, current literature also supports this idea. So I'm going to pause a little second. I want people to think about this just for a minute because 2/3 of stakeholders see the situation as possible inadequacies in school preparation. But what's the real story? I'd really like to know what your experience is. And there is a polling question coming up. And I'm just going to ask a quick yes or no. Do you think the learning activities in your classes contribute to workforce preparedness? And if you're not a teacher at the moment, you're in administration or some other supporting role, please also answer. It would be very helpful as we go to this poll. I'm going to flip over to the poll and I would just like you guys to take a moment, think about it, and go ahead and answer it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and broadcast the results so that people can see them. I'd like everybody just to get a quick view of this. We're looking at 60% of people who voted say yes and 40% say no, and we have no votes. Again, just to follow up for earlier presentations, this is not research in progress. This is not an IRB approved study. So poll questions for this poll and some of the polls coming up in here are for quality assurance purposes only. Results from the poll questions are used to draw conclusions to help develop questions for follow-up research that might be published at a later time. But again, this is not a study that's in progress, so thank you. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and move on to the next question, I think. A little bit of background on why the question, and we can talk about this. For me, teaching and learning in the 21st century really is the best of all times, but not everyone thinks that way. Most of you have heard the concept of 20th century workplace is logical, linear, solid, straight line approaches, while 21st century workplaces are conceptual, holistic, They're made up of many different components that interact in many different ways. That comes from pink, but again, the literature that is more current supports that as well. The way I look at it in this visual depiction is schools have also mimicked this same depiction. It almost seems as if there's a one skill equals one job perception in many of the programs. You're going to be an engineer, you're going to follow an engineering type linear approach to your next job. In the 21st century, we've learned that it's different. You need different types of skills, different types of competencies, and different types of literacies to succeed. So every brick in this linear straight line actually translates into another component of another system that reacts to another system and affects other things. So I'm just going to take a moment, take a look at that, think about it. It impacts some of the things we're going to talk about. As we move on, some of the symptoms that we see, not the problems, not the patches, some of the symptoms that we see, and the reason there's a heightened awareness of this is internationally, young people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than their parents. That's across the world. And then despite increased organizational focus on connecting education to employment, there is a critical skills shortage. This is supported by national efforts, including our own, to increase educational awareness, educational opportunities, and educational programs that connect people in schools to workforce opportunities. Just because there's a symptom, just because there's a perceived problem, doesn't mean that there's a one-to-one correlation, hence the need to explore a little bit further. Based on the symptoms, based on some of the data, it seems that contemporary educational curricula may provide a suboptimal preparation experience for the innovative, dynamic, competitive world that we talk about. What I'm specifically exploring within a specific context, and where I'd like some of your insight and some of your help, is the specific problem, perceived weaknesses in 21st century skills preparation in academic environments as seen by faculty members. There are a few different ways to look at the problem, and I would ask you to imagine that you have your camera-enabled cell phone or your camera-enabled tablet out. You see a very, very big picture out there, and you need to focus in a little bit more on the problem. We're going to look at it from a theoretical framework. We're going to narrow it down a little bit more to a conceptual framework, and we're going to narrow it down even more to technology. Most people here are familiar with constructivism. It's a very, very broad idea. There's literature that supports learning as construction of knowledge from Piaget. There's Vygotsky's social interaction, contributing to cognitive development. There's Bruner's engaged action-based thought, to which individuals apply meaning. But overall, 2 main things about constructivism, according to Dr. Margaret Gredler from USC, by the way. She states that contemporary constructivism capitalizes on 2 main principles: learning as an internal process and cognitive conflict resulting from challenges to one's thinking. Why that's important here is because we're looking at ways that looking at the question will contribute to teaching and learning in the 21st century, and ultimately teaching and learning and how it contributes to 21st century skills. Narrowing it down just a little bit more, we're going to talk about a 21st century learning framework. This represents a collective vision for learning in order to succeed in work and life. It's a very large framework, it's a very common framework, and it encompasses 3 main things: content knowledge, specific skills, and literacies. That comes from the Partnership for 21st Century Skills. I've heard it discussed on various conferences here in the last few days. We're going to talk a little bit more of that. It looks like this. The components are considered interconnected in the process of 21st century teaching and learning. Again, it's a very large framework. It's very interactive as far as all of the different components, and it translates very specifically into what's in curriculum, what's in professional development, and what's in our actual learning environments. I'd like to take this moment to ask one more question of faculty members in particular. Are you familiar with the framework for 21st century learning? I'm going to just take a moment. I'm going to open up the poll, and I'm going to ask you guys. The multiple session. Is there anyone here that needs more time? And I know the mics are off, but you can raise a hand within the layout here. We're broadcasting the results. We have one person who's extremely knowledgeable and familiar with every category and how it translates into the actual classroom activities. And 80% are somewhat familiar with it, may not know the individual components. So again, back to my research question. If I asked people about specific things based on the framework for 21st century learning, how much would people know about it? So just for informational purposes, there are actually 6 main frameworks that include the knowledge, skills, habits, traits, all of those critical factors for workplace success. The framework for 21st century skills happens to be the most generic, but it's also the largest. So the question, are you familiar with this framework, is very specific to the research question that I'm asking. One thing we haven't talked about, but one thing that each of us has in common here is technology. If we're in a distance learning environment, we're using technology to communicate, we're using technology for learning, teaching, and all sorts of things. A few things about educational technology. Educational and instructional technology really aren't the same. We say them as if they are. Educational technology is really learning about technology. Instructional technology is learning through the use of technology. I'm going to pause for just a second, but there's a very specific difference. Most people here use instructional technology on a daily basis. We teach and learn through our learning management systems. We use all the tools that are available to us in our learning management systems. We know from the literature that instructional technology supports theory and practice, enhances design, development, application, management. One defining factor is it excludes standalone hardware and software unless it's applied to instructional challenges. Why that's important to us, it stops all the conversations about tablets in the classrooms, internet access, all very important things, but the conversation is more around how do we use these instructional technology tools versus access to technology or learning about technology. We also know from the literature there's a lot of potential to be had in instructional technology. It contributes to mastery of content knowledge, and it enables usability of knowledge, but we're challenged because there's so much abstract exploration into how it supports, how it assists, how it enhances learning, but we really don't know how to apply it well for concrete actualization. Will Richardson, one of the great giants in educational and instructional technology, described it as possibly layering curriculum with extra tools while ignoring strategy. So my point here is when we look at instructional technology, how best can we use a tool for teaching and for learning? There are so many tools out there. If we did a poll here on what tools in the learning management systems people are using in their classrooms, we would have so many that we need a way of sorting through them. Game-based learning is one of those many, many tools. It's a technology tool. It's known to contribute to learning skills attainment, and you see it in both education and business for learning environments. Specifically, it has potential in contributing to 21st century skills application. It's replicable for educational content. It accommodates varied learning styles, which I know was discussed in an earlier presentation. And game-based learning may provide those transformational opportunities for improving those 21st century skills opportunities. That all comes from Prensky. He's the guy that coined the phrase digital native. Games aren't new. From a historical perspective, we know that they existed back in the time of Herodotus. We know that the Chinese people used games as early as 3000 BC. In a business environment, the US Air Force used games for learning back in 55. The AMA used them in 56. In 61, 100 different business games for learning were used by 3,000 executives. A quick look at what game-based learning looks like throughout the country, throughout the world, and in all of the different industries and places. Again, games aren't new, and they're everywhere. When we talk about games, because they're so prolific, we need to understand the difference between games and play. They're totally different. Games have goals, they have rules, they have feedback, and people want to play them. Play is more free form. People get the two confused because they're both fun, they're both enjoyable. But when we talk about games for learning, we're talking about a specific structure. For instance, play would constitute a game of tag. Game is a game of golf. When we're talking specifically about gamification, we're talking about applying game mechanics and game aesthetics to a non-game environment. Some of the non-game environments that we're talking about are marketing, social change, and more specifically for this presentation, training, development, and education. Most people in academic environments, specifically in higher education, are familiar with the opportunities to construct new knowledge and promote deeper levels of learning through gamification. But one question I have in the proposed research is, can games be used to provide opportunities for surface learning in order to leave room for deeper learning? And the reason for that question is almost an oversimplified question. Most people are comfortable with the differences between surface learning and deeper learning. But according to the literature, we need surface learning in order to get to deeper learning. The question I have in the proposed research is, can we use a game to save time, to provide surface learning, so that people can spend their time on deeper learning? I'll give a quick example from my own experience in teaching. I've taught the same class on personal finance 55 times. There is one activity that comes up in every variation of the curriculum. It's a long, drawn-out Microsoft Word document that people need to go to the textbook, fill out, and show that they understand the basic components of credit. It takes several hours for people to do that exercise. They demonstrate proficiency. You can assess against it. But really, if it had a game and there was a quick assessment, they would have the surface learning and we can focus on the deeper learning. I'm going to just pause for a minute, give everybody an opportunity to think about their own curriculum, their own classrooms, because there's so many opportunities where games are used for education. And just about everybody I've run into recently has used a game in some form for education. Even some of the training materials from Pearson and some of the other vendors also include games for education today. But I want to look at it from a different perspective. I want to look at it from the point of view of context. My question still is, what constitutes faculty perception of preparedness for work in the 21st century? So back to the three ways of looking at it, back to the three ways of narrowing the focus. We've got constructivism, which is learning as an internal process and reflection and challenges to thinking. We've got a framework, which represents content knowledge, specific skills, and literacies. To zone in more fully, we have game-based learning, a way of providing the people who are answering the questions, and I'm going to say it again, answering those questions, some surface knowledge on not only what is game-based learning, but what is 21st century framework components. With some surface knowledge, I believe that the questions will be deeper and based more on relevancy according to the framework. So again, just to wrap it up, the questions are relevant to distance learning professionals. They're learner-centered, they're strategies that support subject matter analysis, and they're based on activities that will strengthen cognitive and behavioral skills. They're motivating, they're appealing, they're simplified, and there's different ways of exploring the problem of education to work-life experiences. It's qualitative, exploratory, and a population of online faculty members. So a question that I'm asking for some feedback on, not through polling, but perhaps through individual comments, is when I ask faculty people their perceptions of 21st century skills, using instructional technology, incorporating some 21st century learning essentials into a game-based exercise, will it help? Will it help focus the participants to complete a questionnaire of open-ended questions related to the major themes? And again, the question I have is, what constitutes faculty perception of preparedness for work life in the 21st century? And if you wanted to provide an equitable contents within which to ask the question, would you consider using a gamified activity to provide surface knowledge that promotes deeper thinking? Again, I just wanted to thank everyone for their time today. As it applies to impacts to our current practice, hopefully it'll outline strengths, weaknesses, best practices, and opportunities for improvement. I see there are many questions coming through. I'm not sure how best to address them. Veronica, perhaps you can offer some insight.
Helen, I moved the specific questions over to your right in your questions box. The rest of the chat was us back and forth agreeing or adding some comments, but the questions are to your right.
Okay, I do appreciate that. And the first question that I see is, do you feel like game-based professional development programs can replace the traditional model of professional development workshops? Yes and no. I don't think they can replace. I think they can augment. I see from the literature and I see from actual practice that there are many workshops that focus on creating something, playing a game, not only as an icebreaker, but creating a game to produce an outcome, to help people learn certain key concepts related to teaching and learning. And I also see a trend in faculty workshops in particular in order to gamify their own learning experiences. That's my take on it. If anyone else wants to jump in, I think we can open up the mics and have anybody offer that as well. Monica, what do you think about that?
Okay, so everyone right now has audio access if you care to speak.
Okay. So much for open mic. I'm glad we're not doing karaoke. Question number 2. Would you agree that digital learning games are useful educational tools with high motivational potential? All of the literature says so. All of the polls say so. I'd like to hear from this group. Is there anybody that thinks differently?
I personally do. As I stated in one of my chat responses, was that for me, um, having a game or something that's very interactive helps me retain that information versus a read and a recall. But something I have to actually interact with helps me with that retention.
Thank you. And that's what the literature shows as well. And I'm looking at the third question about someone was good enough to quote, it looks like the Horizon Report. And it says, certainly games and gamification are important trends in higher education. Are you familiar with any game-based mechanics employed at the institution where you're employed? And for example, Lemon Tree or library game used at some university libraries. I'm not familiar with those specific ones. What I am familiar with is I teach at a business college, and one of the Pearson sets of materials that are provided for us is a Jeopardy game with all of the project management components that are taught in the class. It's a really nice way of getting people into the concepts without 3 chapters of text. There are also many games out there that are being experimented with at different universities across the country. One major university based up in Albany, New York, has game-based learning based on research for graduate students. The APA organization, our favorite grammar police, has an APA game out there that's available to students. There are also some recruiting firms out there that are using personality tests, a game-based personality test that you play the game and it comes back with feedback, and you can choose jobs that you think that you qualify for based on that. So those are some of the things that I've seen. I'm going to go ahead and open it up and just ask, are there any preferred game-based mechanics or game-based ideas that people are using? And
I don't want to take over from the audience, but in my previous role as an instructional designer at another institution, we had a plethora of different tools that we could use, that the designer could use to actually create games and different interactive flip books and things like matching, crossword puzzles, flashcards, and all of those options also included the option for the faculty member to do voiceovers on any of those tools. So if interested, I put a link in the chat area to view just some of those that I still have links to, and were used in courses and still used today.
That's awesome, thank you. I see a fourth question, and it says, despite all the challenges you mentioned in your presentation, would you agree with the following statement? When designed with learning principles in mind, games can increase student motivation, engagement, and learning. If so, where is game-based learning going in the future, and what are the thoughts? I'm going to go back to the 2015 Horizon Report, the 2014 Horizon Report, the 2013 Horizon Report, the 2012 Horizon Report, which of course represents international input from organizations across the country. It's going as far as where we take it. It's a tool. It depends on how well we use the tool. If we use it like chocolate-covered broccoli, which is a really disgusting expression, we're only making something seem palatable when it's not, or we can use it as a real tool to promote teaching and learning in each of our environments. And then I see a final question, and it says, what is effective game-based learning and why does it work? Effective game-based learning is, by definition, using it as an instructional tool that contributes to positive outcomes. And positive outcomes are outcomes that are predefined in our educational outcomes within our curriculum. If the outcome is to understand the four principles of credit, then an effective use of game-based learning is to use it as a tool for that outcome. I'd like to, again, open it up to anyone else. Do they have a different definition? Okay, I really appreciate the feedback. I really appreciate all of the interaction. Are there any other final comments before we wrap up today's presentation?
Everyone still has audio access if you want to participate verbally. I have just pushed out to your browser. You should get it in a new window. The survey for Helen's presentation. So if you would take about 15-30 seconds to fill that out, I know she would appreciate it. And Helen, you may want to at some point go back and review the comments made in the chat area. It was very active. A lot of great points and links for references that you might can use in the future.
Absolutely, and thank you everyone for participating.